Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. Everything in my life seems to be happening in Southampton right now. Only a week ago or 10 days ago, the mayor and I, and many others, were saying goodbye to Lord Nelson, the square-rigged ship that's going around the world for the Jubilee Sailing Trust. My son's bought a house on the Solent, expensive one too, and I managed to do that. And I have a boat round the corner from here. I came here to look at the Wellington papers once I started getting excited by the idea of doing a project on the Duke of Wellington. And of course, only, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, in this very lecture hall, I heard that great master of lecturing on the Duke and many other military subjects called Richard Holmes, who so sadly passed away a few months ago, effectively, it seems to me. And that was a great loss to us all. But what I'm going to do is talk to you about this extraordinary story that Anne's already mentioned. He was undoubtedly, for me, the most meticulous, matchless tactician and strategist of all time. He wasn't fussed about the kind of thing that his great opponent was fussed about, conquering all sorts of other countries, grandly parading in the diplomatic and political world. He was a man who was absolutely single-mindedly dedicated to defeating the enemy of the government had decided was the enemy, which was, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. They never met. They never fought each other until, of course, the great Battle of Waterloo, in which Napoleon was decisively defeated. So one may think Napoleon was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest, military commander of all time, but when he met his master at Waterloo, he was completely outsmarted. Now, what excited me about this story, about the idea of writing this book, about studying Wellington, was the fact that of the people who fought with him throughout his campaigns, many, many of them wrote their diaries and memoirs and books about what they'd experienced, what they made of what it was like to fight in those battles, the horrific conditions in which they had to fight, the appalling medical conditions. And, of course, most importantly, we hear from them what they thought of Arthur Wellesley himself, the Duke of Wellington. He was an extraordinary man. I mean, he was a haughty man with a rather long nose. He used to look down that long nose of his rather arrogantly at people, and he didn't suffer fools gladly. The people in his armies, I suspect, didn't love him very much, but by God, they respected him, because he won every battle he ever fought. He was an extraordinary master of timing and ground on a battlefield. And he also had a fascinating private life. Many people think that Wellington was just a soldier, full stop. He was, of course, later a great politician, a soldier, and that's about it. And that he had really very little character and personality apart from this extraordinary self-confidence. I think that's quite wrong. There are many occasions in his life and in his campaigns when we see that he was a deeply emotional man as well, and one who could give vent to great feeling about the kind of thing that his efforts and others were leading to on the battlefield. And of course, he was a great ladies' man, as I will tell you as well. Now, the story really begins in 1808. Napoleon occupied Spain and Portugal. It was probably the biggest mistake he ever made. And he put on the throne of Spain his brother Joseph, a highly incompetent fellow who made a complete nonsense of it. And Spain and Portugal rose in rebellion against Napoleon. And this gave Britain a huge opportunity. In the Napoleonic Wars, of course, Napoleon was moving to take over most of the rest of Europe, apart from Britain, which Nelson had 10 years earlier effectively saved for the country with his tremendous victories. It was decided in London, very quickly really, when the rebellions began in Spain and Portugal, that here was a huge opportunity to get at Napoleon on land. We'd done it at sea, now was a chance to get at him on land. And so we decided to send an expedition under Arthur Wellesley, a youngish general at the time, who'd had a very distinguished career in India, which not that many people knew a great deal about, but he had learned a huge amount about military strategy and tactics in India. So he came back with quite a distinguished Indian history behind him. And he was sent off with a fairly small army, about 15,000, 17,000 men, to Mondego Bay in Portugal, to see if he could get a foothold in Portugal and start pushing the French back. And so his ships pulled up in outside Mondego Bay, coast of Portugal. Anybody who sailed will know that it's an appalling coast. It's dead straight. There's just the odd little bay like Mondego Bay. And there you get one or two ships got right in. You can see them at anchor there, and the chaps unloaded. But most of the ships were out at sea, rolling around in quite a swell. And people like Jonathan Leach of the Rifles, young chap who'd had very little military experience really, although he was more experienced than some, he was very upset because the swell, the rocking of the ship from side to side, pushed the wine glasses onto the floor and shattered them. So here's this young chap going out thinking it's all going to be a bit of a doddle meeting these Frenchmen, and we'll have lots of wine and great fun. Little did he know what was to come. There he was complaining about the wine glasses being shattered. So there we are, Mondego Bay, and Wellesley lands with his chaps up at Mondego Bay, halfway between Oporto and Lisbon. There are the guys, the red coats, huge, heavy uniforms. It was so sweaty. August the 1st, 1808, incredibly hot. Within moments, the lovely red uniforms were covered in dust. They were carrying, most of them, their muskets. Some had rifles, some had muskets. Very few had rifles. The advantage of having a rifle was quite considerable. Those of you, I'm sure, who know about these things will know that the musket has an effective range of little more than 50 meters, maybe 100 if you were lucky. The rifle had a range 2 or 3 times that. 200 to 300 meters, you could kill someone with a rifle. You're pretty unlikely to hit him dead on with a musket. So most of them are carrying their muskets, 70 rounds of musket balls, and all that heavy kit as well. It was a hell of a sweat getting down that coast. But they marched down towards Lisbon to see if they could find the French. And they found the French at Vimero. And the Frenchman that they found there was General Andoche Junot, rather arrogant chap who thought this is ridiculous. What on earth these Brits think they're doing, stepping on the land? I mean, have they never heard of Austerlitz and Jena and Wagram? This is ridiculous. What do they think they're doing? Andoche Junot marched his chaps up from Lisbon, which of course the French held because they'd oppressed and conquered the Portuguese and Spanish. And he marched up, and it was assumed that he would march up the coast. It was flat at the coast, it's slightly more hilly and awkward inland. So Wellesley planted his chaps along there. You can see the red slabs are Wellesley's brigades, and here comes Junot, not up the coast from the south, but southeast. He came up from the southeast. Wellesley took one look. He had a few scouts out, and they said, General, they're coming up not from the south, but from the southeast. So Wellesley said, right, better switch the guys around quickly, which he did. Didn't take long. Very, very fast master of terrain, this guy. And he occupied that ridge that you can see going up there towards Ventosa in the northeast. And he left one brigade down there facing south just in case, but most of them moved, he shifted over facing southeast. Thank God he did, because that was where Andoche Junot came in. And Wellesley did other things too. He had a clear perception that what was vital in defense particularly was to keep your chaps in line, rather than in square or anything else, in line if you're faced by infantry, and to put them just behind the brow of the hill. So he put his guys just behind the brows of those hills there, so that when the French came up in the formation that was easiest to advance in, which was the column, perhaps 30 guys wide by 30 deep. Terribly frightening thing to see coming straight at you, a column. Absolutely terrifying, looking like a great big sort of thundering spearhead of people coming straight at you. The trouble with a column is that if you're on the 3rd or 4th rank behind the front, you can't use your musket. So you only really have 30 or 60 muskets able to fire, whereas Wellesley, once his chaps got up, when the light infantry in front of the brow of the hill tipped him off, once the chaps were up, they were standing in line, every single musket was brought to bear on the enemy. And all of those attacks were completely defeated. The French lost 750 casualties, 1,500, the Brits lost 750, and here on the right you can see what's happening. There's Wellesley himself, always very close to the front line without being in it, just behind it, close enough to talk to the battalion commanders. Close enough always, absolutely hands-on, always to be in range of the people he had to talk to and he had to deploy and switch and so on. And you see on the right there, the British in line, 3 lines, all those muskets can be brought to bear. The French, I don't even really see it properly, but the French there with the tricolour advancing in column. And it was a disaster for the French, for Miro, an absolute disaster. They were defeated. It led really to the French leaving Portugal. It was a tough little winter though, 1808-9 for Wellesley. He went home. His marriage was not looking too good. He had married the daughter and then sister of Lord Longford. The new Lord Longford was Kitty Pakenham's sister. And when Lord Longford originally was asked by Wellesley, a long time before he went to India, could I marry your daughter? He rather fell for her way back. Longford said, no, of course not, you've got no future, young man. I can see no point, absolutely pointless exercise. I'm certainly not having anything to do with it. My daughter's far too good for you. He got back from India, and he thought he would ask her again. She said yes, and he immediately said, my dear chap, most welcome. Your Indian campaign was very successful. I do congratulate you. And so Kitty and Arthur got married. But very soon, and certainly after he got back from Vimero, he found himself finding this marriage was not very rewarding. She was a very inward-looking person. She was rather timid. She was a lovely person, I'm sure, but she was very, very introverted. And he had a huge future ahead of him. He mentioned when he actually got married to her, which was an extraordinary moment. One of his friends was with him, and before he got married to her, he said to his friends, she's grown rather ugly, hasn't she? Extraordinary man. And that, I suppose, explains partly why, as early as 1809, he was having an affair with Harriet Wilson, famous courtesan in London. It wasn't that unusual for chaps of this sort of stature to chase the courtesans, but she was a bit naughty because she decided to write her memoirs a bit later on. I'm sure you all know the story. She wrote her memoirs, and the editor of the memoirs said to, got word to the Duke of Wellington, as he became later on, look, I don't think we ought to publish all this stuff about you and her, do you? What about a few £1,000s? And he just didn't even think about it. He just said, you publish and be damned. And she did publish. It didn't do her much good, really, because by that time everybody knew that he was quite a ladies' man. And so his private life was a bit questionable, one might say. But his public life went from strength to strength. He went back to Portugal in 1809, told to regain the whole of Portugal, because the French had moved in again in the north a bit, as we'll see in a moment. And he took with him a number of interesting people who I'm going to introduce you to very quickly now, because writing this book and the whole project was full of this wonderful material that I got from people like Thomas Picton, the very irascible old Welshman who didn't like taking orders very much, certainly not from chaps like Wellesley, and people like Robert Crawford, known as Black Bob. He was the commander of the Riflemen, very important unit, the Riflemen, the 1st 95th, and Robert Crawford was their commander. He was a very tough lad. He was a real disciplinarian, like Wellesley himself, but even more so. And Crawford, for example, one day he was very keen, as Wellesley was, on commissariat, on supplies, on his men being fed every night. And one of his commissariat officers said to Crawford one evening, General, I have a terrible problem. The bread's a bit short. I don't think all the guys are going to be able to get their bread tonight. And so Crawford said, well, look, I tell you what, if you don't get them all bread tonight, I will hang you. So this poor commissary officer went up to Wellesley, thinking I shouldn't really be going behind the general's back, but I really must have a word with the commander-in-chief. And he said to Wellesley, look, General, I wonder if I could just ask your help, really. I've got General Crawford telling me that if I don't supply all his men with bread, which I really can't, he's going to hang me. And Wellesley said, well, young man, if I were you, I should certainly do it because he will hang you. Fred Ponsonby, I mean, just to take a few names out of a hat, really. Wonderful guy. He was the son of the Countess of Bessborough, the Earl of Bessborough, and his sister was Lady Caroline Lamb. He was an aristocrat. Wellesley liked working with aristocrats. He trusted them. He found he could talk to them. Many of them were pretty stupid, but Wellesley had this passion for working with aristocratic officers. Fred was certainly one of them. He was a great cavalry commander. He was a little bit reckless, as we'll see in a moment, but he's a bit of a gambler, too. He's a great character. So there's Fred Ponsonby. He, of course, wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote the story of his extraordinary escape at Waterloo, which I'll come to later. Ordinary rifleman Ned Costello worked with Robert Crawford's rifleman in the 95th. He wrote an extraordinarily impressive book. You can buy it today. Rifleman Costello. Wonderful stories, written in such modern English. Actually, he's an Irishman, but written in modern Irish, if you like. A wonderful memoirist and raconteur, and very funny as well. He is a very brave man indeed. He's volunteered frequently for leading guys into the breaches of the sieges. One interesting thing about Wellesley's army when he went off the peninsula, and it was not unusual, but it was strongly adhered to by him, was that something like 10% of the lads could take their wives to war with them. They were allowed a half a man's rations. The children were allowed a quarter of a man's rations, quite right too. The wives only half, quite right too. You can see here some of the women, this is a cartoon in the London cartoon. You can see here some of the women going along. Because every 9 months, as you can imagine, a child will appear, a baby would appear. So there's one woman there carrying a couple of babies. And rather fun here at the back, there's a chap here who's got the right idea as well. He's been carried by his wife, carried on her back. But women were very useful. They did a lot of good work. They helped feed and care for the guys. And it was an important part of it. Extraordinary that the wives went along with some of the wives went along with their husbands. Anyway, back to the 1809 campaign. Wellesley landed in Lisbon, which of course was retaken from the French by him after Vimero. And he then pushed up because, unfortunately, Oporto had been recaptured by an awkward character called Nicholas Soult, quite an impressive general, one of Napoleon's best. But again, someone who thought that there'd be really no problem with this Brit. And he had his headquarters. You can see, I don't know whether you can see his headquarters there, Soult headquarters, there, facing, interestingly, understandably perhaps, out to sea, because the plain was flat here, placed across the Douro, if you were coming around from the north, was down here. It was flat open country. The likeliest way to attack Oporto would be from the flat coastal plain. But Wellesley, of course, did precisely the opposite. By the way, the little green bits here are the beginnings of the Portuguese element in the Anglo-Allied army, mostly Brits, but you do have some Portuguese coming in. The Portuguese, hugely anti-French, good soldiers, forming very effective battalions within a very short time of the rebellion beginning. Anyway, in went Wellesley here, and he then crossed the Douro, where it was not flat, but very much of a canyon. You can see it here. It's very, very high cliffs here. But he crossed here without the French, without Soult really knowing what was happening. Soult was having breakfast facing west in his rather smart headquarters. When Wellesley was crossing the Douro, in some wine boats he'd managed to find, some barges he'd managed to pinch. And across they went, up to the seminary up on the cliff here, and then they turned west and took Oporto from the east. Soult left his breakfast rather sharply, and Wellesley and his teammates, his commanders, tucked into Soult's breakfast. So the next thing that happened, later the same year, was that Wellesley moved into Spain. Things had gone so well in Portugal, he started moving towards Madrid. It may have been a step too far, because at the Battle of Talavera on 28th of July, 1809, about 3-4 months after Oporto, he met quite a substantial French army, and although he won the battle in the sense that he was left on the battlefield after it when the French withdrew, he lost 5,000 casualties at Talavera. It was a big battle, successfully fought by Wellesley, but it was an expensive cost in human life. Old Fred Ponsonby, I mentioned that he was a bit of a reckless chap. He led some of the cavalry at Talavera, and he charged with his lads. Wellesley said, look, you need to take out that infantry unit over on there on the left. And Fred and his lads went in, his light dragoons went in on the left-hand side, and they totally scattered the French infantry. But then they went beyond that. They got so excited about the success they'd had against infantry that they went beyond that another 300, 400, 500 yards, and they found themselves surrounded by French cavalry, and they had a terrible time. And Fred said in a letter to his mum, dear mother, it wasn't very agreeable of my first contact with the French. We lost 220 men and 180 horses. And the odd thing was the French didn't run when we charged them. So it was a worry. And Wellesley found his cavalry awkward right the way through from the beginning here to the end. He found that the cavalry were not people he could really control properly. It was always a problem. Wellesley, then Wellington, found that getting the infantry and cavalry working together was never something he really ever got a handle on. Medicine was terrifying in those days. After Talavera here, we have the pictures here of chaps being carried off, one lucky man being carried off by two of his mates there on a sort of stretcher, others being tended by doctors on the side of the field. What tended to happen if you were hit by a musket ball in your arm or leg? If it was in your body, you were in trouble. If it's your arm or leg, the recommendation of the doctors usually was to have the limb amputated. And here we have a rather terrifying contemporary picture of one chap who is being attended by 5 people you can see around him. His arm has a musket ball in it here, and the decision has obviously been made, and he's been persuaded to accept that he had the arm amputated. And so this chap here is going to pull it off, while this surgeon here cuts it off. These people hold him up, this man here with his hand firmly on the subclavian artery to stop the blood pouring out if he can, and this chap was supporting him. The best chance was that the person would faint, and they usually did, and that would be fine, but there was no anesthetic, anything like that, until about the 1840s. So it's a terrifying picture, only, 200 years ago now. They had, of course, some time in camps. They had some time for leisure. They had some time to play all sorts of games, but soccer and other games. And they also had time to go and visit the local people. And the great thing about the Peninsular Campaign, what Wellesley was terribly keen on, was hearts and minds of the local people being on our side. And so he was passionately determined to make sure people didn't rob farmers of their chickens and their pigs. He was passionately concerned to make sure we treated and explained ourselves what was going on. You know, they're modern general in many ways, in this way particularly. But they had a great fun. Young lad called August Schaman from the King's German Legion, they fought with Wellesley's troops. He wrote a wonderful, I do recommend it to you, you can find it today on the road to Waterloo. And he writes this wonderful memoir in which he says that one village, he had 6 girlfriends. 6 girlfriends. All of them were lovers, including, particularly important one, was the wife of the church organist, because she was particularly available on Sunday mornings. Yeah, it's true, I mean, he does say that, it's very funny. And look at the baby-faced chap. The sanitary conditions, the conditions in which they existed in the camps, of course, were appalling. They hadn't really yet caught up with the need to have proper lavatories and this, that, and the other. And so you can imagine that the problem was, of course, that what happened was that 3/4 of the deaths in Wellesley's army in Portugal and Spain, 3/4 of those deaths were caused by disease. Typhus, all sorts of other, dysentery and goodness knows what. They died, most of them, because they were not fit. And because they'd probably been poisoned by drinking terrible water and mixing themselves up with all sorts of disgusting things. And so it happened like that. But one thing that did happen was that they fraternized a great deal, of course, these lads, with the French. And one story I quite like is that they didn't always fight the French. Occasionally they were having a chat with them. And at one river frontier in Portugal, there was one young lad who was a sort of sentry, and the French were just over the other side of the river, I mean, 10 meters away. And one evening, he got his mess tin, he put some money in the mess tin, and he pushed the mess tin onto a rock in the middle of the river, and he shouted, he sort of shouting whisper, "Cognac! Cognac!" The following morning, he pulled the mess tin back, and my dear, the money was gone, and it was half full, he says, of a rather indifferent brandy. Quite fun. But that sort of thing was happening all the time. After Talavera, Arthur Wellesley became Lord Wellington. And he said to his brother, he said, look, it's a task of mine, I need to find a suitable place. Wellesley, can you get something near that as you can? Any ideas? And off went William, I think it was. I'm not sure which one it was. One of his brothers had the job of William. William, his brother, was asked to find a suitable town which he could be lord of, and he found Wellington in Somerset, so he became Lord Wellington. Now, in 1810, the next year, he faced a new problem. Andre Massena, he was most impressed by Massena, Wellington as he now was. Massena was a very dangerous man, an extremely flexible, ingenious, and talented general. The third in line, we've had Junot, we've had Soult, they both had came for the high jump, and now Massena's coming for the high jump. And Andre Massena led an army of 50,000 men into Portugal in July 1810, and he arrived here on the River Coa, and he found Robert Crawford's riflemen and several other units forward of Wellington's main force, which was kept on the west bank. And Wellington said to Crawford, I really would prefer it if you'd stay on the west bank of this very dicey river, the Coa, because crossing back over it, if you're pushed back, will be very difficult. And there was only this bridge. And Crawford's riflemen and some of the best troops in Wellington's army were on the east side. You're looking now north, so the east side's over there. Here's Massena coming in from this way. The French completely outnumbered Crawford's men over here, and Crawford's men were pushed back. They fought very bravely. They were pushed back across this bridge, which I took this picture last year, and it's exactly the same today. Wonderful thing to go and look at today. And this is still here, the sort of halfway mark across the bridge. And they found themselves running across this bridge, and Ned Costello, that wonderful Irishman I mentioned, he had to drag himself across here. He was badly wounded, drag himself across here, and he was only saved by being able to say to one chap, look, please give an Irishman a lift, will you, because I'm not going to make it on my own. And fortunately, Ned was hoiked onto the back of one of his comrades in the 95th Rifles, and so he made it across here. But after the Coa, Wellington drew up his men at a place called Busaco. You can see here on the map, there's the Coa where Crawford was pushed back. I think it's wrong to say he was defeated at the Coa. It was a fighting withdrawal, the Coa. Pushed back, and Wellington had chosen the ridge of Busaco, almost incredulously wondering whether the French would attack him on this huge ridge. It was a monumental position, terribly powerful position. He spread his chaps all the way along this ridge, and the French, Massena had a go at it, heavily defeated. Busaco was a disaster for the French in September 1810, but Massena, canny lad that he was, had found a way round for the rest of his army who survived Busaco, and he started going round the top there and down the coast towards Lisbon. Well, of course, Wellington was one step ahead. He'd thought this sort of thing might happen, and just in case it was going to happen, he told his chief engineer to build fortifications about 10 miles north of Lisbon at a place called some hills called Torres Vedras. There's a town of Torres Vedras still there today, and you can see these hills now, and you can see some of the fortifications that his chief engineer built there. And it was an incredibly marvelous bit of foresight, because when the French got down there, Wellington retreated very rapidly to Torres Vedras after Busaco, although he'd won the Battle of Busaco, and he was able then to place his chaps on the ridges here, on the high points of the Torres Vedras hills, in 3 whole lines of fortifications. Massena took one look, had a go at them, turned round, and decided to live off the land until the spring. But it was dreadful. Massena was starved off the land. And it was such, the Portuguese, of course, were so anti-French, so determined not to let them have any food that they scrubbed all their food and burnt all their crops. And the French went back, Massena went back into Spain, and Napoleon promptly sacked him. The extraordinary thing is that he'd been through 3 marshals now, and he still didn't go himself. He was quite busy, Napoleon, of course. I mean, 1812 was popping along, and he was looking east. And we must always remember the fact, rather like the Second World War, that the real threat to Napoleon, the real problem for Napoleon was coping with Central and Eastern Europe. That was his decision, of course, to have a go at them and to try and conquer them and subdue them. But he was determined to conquer the Russians, to have a go at Russia in 1812. And mercifully for Wellington, who was quite happily moving gently up the peninsula, that kept Napoleon busy. But Wellington always said, Napoleon on the battlefield against me would have been worth 40,000 extra troops. And 40,000 troops, when they're only really talking about 60,000 each, 50, 60,000 each, would have been a huge difference if Napoleon had come himself. But he didn't. And in the next couple of years, 11 and 12, we have these wonderful moments when Wellington is crossing into Spain again, getting back into Spain, and pushing the French back. Here's a crossing the River Guadiana. I found this sketch in a farmhouse in Gloucestershire, drawn by a cavalry officer who's just explaining to us how they got the horses across this River Guadiana. Fascinating. They had these huge rafts. And you can see there's 3 blokes here who are pulling on this rope to pull the raft across with the horses on. So you get a picture of Wellington's men crossing back into Spain. And at the beginning, I'm skipping rather quickly now, 1812, the beginning of the 1812 campaign, in 1811 Massena was removed. In 1812, Wellington was about to launch himself properly into Spain again. Now he had 2 key places to capture which he didn't want to leave behind him. One was Badajoz, a huge fortress down here in the south of Spain, and the other was Ciudad Rodrigo up in the north. Huge fortress towns. Just look at Ciudad Rodrigo here. That's what it looks like today. Much the same as it looked then. Ciudad Rodrigo, and I do recommend any of you who haven't been there, it's one of the first places I would go if you're excited by the Peninsula Campaign. Extraordinary place. Ciudad Rodrigo, we're looking down it from the northwest now, and Wellington had to capture it. January 1812. And he said to Thomas Picton, remember that Welshman I mentioned? Tough old boot. You know, he ran the 3rd Division, the fighting 3rd Division, they call themselves. And Picton was told to go for this corner here. Wellington said, look, I'll batter it down. That'll be your breach, Thomas. You're going to go for that one. And Robert Crawford was told to go for the North Gate here with his riflemen. So in they went in January 1812, and a dreadful thing happened as Picton's lads went through the breach. Well, Wellington made 2 breaches successfully, by the way. In went Picton into the breach in the northwest corner. Just as they were going in a mine, a great big explosion went boom, and 30 blokes were killed almost immediately. But Picton managed to get in and took the northern western side of Ciudad Rodrigo. In went Crawford through the gate successfully, but tragically Crawford himself was fatally wounded. And so that was the end of Black Bob Crawford. And he was hugely missed by Wellington and his own riflemen. But Ciudad Rodrigo fell. And there's a rather lovely picture the following morning. You can see, I mean, you remember the picture of it today, the photograph I took earlier. I didn't take it, sorry, it was taken from an airplane. But you can see here how similar it looks. There's the Picton breach, and there's the Crawford breach. And this is the chaps painting it, the 2 lads painting this watercolor the morning after. And if you go to Ciudad Rodrigo today, you will see that you can see the new stonework that of course, Wellington's men built up and others built up, and the Spanish built up in this area here to repair the breaches. So that was the end of Ciudad Rodrigo. This was a much tougher nut to crack. This was probably the bloodiest night of the entire Peninsular War, when 5,000 British casualties happened as they were attacking the breaches down here at Badajoz, and also the castle walls here and northwest corner of Badajoz. It was a tremendously difficult night for Wellington. He was looking pretty desperate by about midnight. And they failed really to get in here. Some of the best troops were down here, the light divisions and the 4th Division down here. They could not get, they made breaches all right, but they could not really get in. And it was good old Thomas Picton who managed to get in into the castle. And his guys climbed up the walls, 30-foot-high walls on ladders, and they got in here. They managed to mount, to escalade the walls. They took down the French tricolour. One of the blokes, they hadn't got any flags, but they bunged up a red coat uniform on the flagpole here to represent the British success. And of course, Wellington was hugely relieved when he heard the news of the successful capture of the citadel, the castle at Badajoz, and the city then very quickly fell. There are the walls today. I mean, just look at that. Those are walls that they went up on ladders in April 1812. Now, what followed that was a disgraceful plundering and looting and raping that took place in the city of Badajoz after the success. And Wellington was appalled at it. Here's a picture, it's a bit indistinct, I expect. Here's a picture of him here in the breach. The breaches they'd failed to get through initially on the south side of Badajoz. And here he is. In fact, he was seen by Picton to be in tears, looking at the appalling carnage. I said 5,000 or so casualties. And Picton went up to him and said, "What's the matter with you?" And poor old Wellington said, "Well, just look at what has happened as a result of our effort to take this city." And it was dreadful what happened then. The Brits behaved disgracefully badly. Wellington tried to stop them. Perhaps he could have done more to stop them, but there's another story. We can talk about that afterwards, perhaps. They behaved very badly indeed. And one of the young ladies who was badly treated was a lady called Juana Dolores. She was only 14, a very beautiful young lady of 14. And she and her friend were seen walking up the street by Captain Harry Smith. Harry Smith, a wonderful character, wrote wonderful diaries. The autobiography of Harry Smith is an absolute must for any of you interested in the Wellington Wars. Harry Smith wrote a wonderful memoir. He was a rifleman, the 1st 95th, and he saw these two girls coming up, and he said, "What's the matter with you?" And they had blood pouring down from their ears here, because the British soldiers had pinched their ear, pulled their earrings, not just said, "May I have your earring?" but they just pulled them off. And so they were in tears. And Harry said, "Oh, this is dreadful. But you're under my protection from now on." And half an hour later, he proposed to Juana and said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "Yes." And it was lovely. And from then on, and they were an absolutely wonderful marriage, a wonderful couple. He called her his guardian angel, and they went on right the way through. She followed him all the way to Waterloo, all the way through Waterloo as well, and went to see where he was on the battlefield and find him and bring him back and give him a glass of beer or whatever he wanted. And she was amazing, and he called her his guardian angel. And they went right the way through. He became a general later on, to South Africa, where he was governor of the Cape Province. And they were so fond of them, the South Africans, sort of 40 years later, that they named 2 cities after Juana and Harry. One was Harry Smith, and the other was Lady Smith. Rather lovely. So that's the story of Harry and Juana, one of his many stories. And now just to take you very quickly through the 1812-13 campaigns, when Wellington was just pushing the French remorselessly forward, never going for a huge, big battle with all the French armies together, always trying to pick off an army he knew he could beat. He always said that the mark of a great general is to know when to retreat and to dare to do it. He did that after he successfully won the Battle of Salamanca, a place called Burgos up here. He had a disastrous failure to besiege Burgos, and he retreated all the way back to Portugal. Very sensibly, because he was faced by a lot of French armies. But the Battle of Salamanca was a huge success in 1812. This was a battle in which he was up here in having a picnic, actually, in the middle of the day. And Marmont, the next French marshal for the high jump, was coming down here, trying to slip past, well, not slip past, to march past the Brits and to try and cut off their line of supply from Portugal here. So Marmont's army is moving sideways like this, and here's Wellington facing south. And he's having his lunch, and he's having a chicken, cold chicken. And he looked down there, and he saw Marmont's armies marching past, and everybody watching him and watching the armies watching. And suddenly he said, that'll do. Marmont est perdu. Marmont is finished. He said, what? And he rode off. He jumped on his horse. All his staff, what the hell's he doing? He leapt on his horse. This is a man he had no deputy. He didn't believe in deputizing his command. He was in charge, and thank God he never got badly wounded. He was always in charge. He made sure he was in charge and that he only knew exactly what to do. Off he went on his horse, went over to his brother-in-law, his wife Kitty Pakenham was a Pakenham. Ned Pakenham commanded the 3rd Division over here, and he said to Ned, Ned, you see that French division there? They've gone rather too far ahead of the one behind them. I think you should go and attack them, and I'll send some cavalry to your assistance. And so in went Ned Pakenham, totally destroyed Thomier, General Thomier's division here, with the assistance of cavalry, and then one by one, Wellington picked off the French divisions at Salamanca. And it was extraordinary. I mean, he timed it exactly right. He could see what the terrain was like. Here's a picture of him running the battle. There he is up there telling his staff and his generals what to do. And he knew exactly when to move in the reserves. There was a division under General Clinton, no relation, General Clinton. And he was sent in just at the right moment when the center got rather dodgy later on in the Battle of Salamanca. And Clinton really rescued the position. But Wellington knew when to deploy him. Wellington was always there keeping an eye open, and never very far behind the front line. Then there was the Battle of Vitoria, a whole year later. By this time, I think I told you he'd retreated from Burgos. It was bad news, but he did that. We didn't want to avoid fighting too big a French army. But by the time of Vitoria in 1813, he had enough men, he reckoned, to face the best that Joseph could put together. You remember that disastrous fellow, Joseph Bonaparte, who by now had pulled out of Madrid, taking an awful lot of spoil with him, and was heading back for France, and began to make a last stand here. And he thought he'd survive, because the river Zadorra rather conveniently went all round Vitoria, but rather stupidly, the French left all the bridges intact. And so Wellington took one look here and he said, right, I'm going to go in from 4 different directions. I'm going to go in from the north, across the Gamara Bridge here. I'm going to go up here and come down from the heights of Puebla. I'm going in myself from the west, and I'm going to send good old Thomas Picton and a chap called Lord Dalhousie in from the north. Well, Thomas Picton was in charge of the 3rd Division, the fighting 3rd, and he was sitting there on his horse looking down at the French, thinking, by the time I attacked, when up came a chap on a horse, one of the aide-de-camp from Wellington. And Thomas Picton said, yes, young man, what can I do for you? And the young chap said, Sir Thomas, I'm directed by Lord Wellington to ask you whether you would be kind enough just to wait for Lord Dalhousie to come, because you and he together will be able to attack across the bridge. Thomas Picton said, you go back and tell Lord Wellington that I'm not waiting for any Lord Dalhousie. I'm going down across that bridge right now. Come on, lads, let's go. And so Picton then went down with his lads, and they crossed the bridge, and they began rolling up the front line here of the French defense. Wellington, of course, was furious initially, but then he recovered his composure when he saw what Thomas Picton had done, and the French collapsed, the position collapsed. With these 4 almost synchronized attacks, it was a brilliant piece of maneuvering. No mobile phones, as Andy was saying earlier, no mobile phones, no helicopters, no radios, but he had them all going in more or less at the same time. And it was a great success. Vitoria was a disaster for the French. They started heading back for France, and when they left the battlefield, they left behind them a huge number of wagons with the spoil, the booty that they'd seized from Madrid. And among them were some canvases rolled up. they found these rolls of canvas, and some of these guys brought them to Wellington and said, my lord, we have here some canvases. And Wellington opened them up. Caravaggio, Murillo, you name it. And he said, I'll take these back and I'll put them up on the walls of Apsley House. And so I'm cutting the corner a bit. He took them home. And they are still on the walls of Apsley House. And each one that was pinched, wait a moment, don't jump the gun, from Vitoria, from the French at Vitoria, has a little black X in the lower left-hand corner. But he did write, immediately after, being an honest fellow, he did write to the King of Spain, who succeeded in Spain after the defeat of Napoleon, and he said, dear King, I have your pictures, which I got back from the French in Vitoria. I will, of course, now return them. And the king, as I understand it, wrote back saying, my lord, your grace, Duke of Wellington, I will have nothing of the kind back from you. You keep them. You liberated our country from that terrible Frenchman. So that was Vitoria. And after that, very quickly, the French were wrapped up. There was the Battle of Sorauren, the Bid of Soa, San Sebastian, a successful siege by the Brits, again, very bloody one. And then they moved into France in early 1814. Battle of the Nivelle, Battle of Bayonne, the Battle of the Nive, and finally, in the spring of 1814, the Battle of Toulouse. And it was after the Battle of Toulouse, and again, always, I mean, some generals might have gone in a few weeks from Vitoria to Toulouse, but not Wellington. Wellington didn't want to risk too many lives, didn't want to meet too many French, and didn't want to force Napoleon to come and face him on the battlefield. Napoleon, by this time, was very busy, again, fortunately for Wellington, very busy fighting the Central Europeans in the central and east of Europe. He'd, of course, been defeated by the Russians and pushed back, well, not defeated by the Russians, but pushed back out of Russia by the weather, mainly. Anyway, he got as far as Toulouse, Wellington, and it was then he heard that Napoleon, largely as a result not of his campaign so much as by what had happened in Central Europe at the Battle of Leipzig, a disastrous defeat for Napoleon's forces, and Napoleon abdicated. Napoleon abdicated and was sent off very cleverly. The Allies sent him off to an island that was not several thousand miles away from France, but a few hundred. No, actually not a few hundred, about 120. Elba. He was sent to Elba, and Wellington, again rather odd move, was asked whether he'd like to be ambassador in Paris. So he went to be ambassador to the nation he just defeated. So it was obviously a bit dodgy, but anyway, he went there, and he made the best of it. He had a good time there. I mentioned he's a ladies' man already. And two of Napoleon's mistresses, including Mademoiselle Georges here, actress, are said to have slept with he became a duke by now, by the way. He was now the Duke of Wellington after the Battle of Toulouse, when he was ambassador in Paris. And Mademoiselle Georges, of course, she too had to write her memoirs. And she said, she said in the book she'd been Napoleon's mistress, and she'd also had the pleasure of the company of the Duke of Wellington. And she said, but I must say, of the two, the Duke was by far the more vigorous. By this time, I mean, soon after this, so this is a slightly later cartoon, but really he had become a sort of well-known ladies' man. People didn't admire him any less for it. And there's a wonderful, I'm very fond of this cartoon here, it's actually in the book, the illustration. And you've got these ladies here, and of course, all these wonderful bubbles they have on the cartoons. And one of them is saying, blimey, what a whopper. I hope he doesn't aim it at me. Anyway, there he is. And of course, by this time, the Paris, and we're trying to sort out the future of Europe, when suddenly this bloke goes and turns up again. And he came back from Elba, as we know, and France rallied to him. The Grande Armée, which had been shattered at Leipzig and destroyed in Moscow and the battles that followed and the crossing of the Beresina, and yet they rallied to him. They rallied to Napoleon. And Napoleon managed to collect an army of something like 100,000 men, and within a few months, 100 days of returning to France, he had advanced up to the Belgian border, crossed the river Sambre, here he is, the blue ones, and Napoleon formed his chaps up, facing the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, and he had his infantry in front, his cavalry behind. He himself was back here somewhere, Imperial Guard in reserve, and some light dragoons up here. Wellington's line on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean was, as you can see, mixed. A third of it only British. The grey ones, it doesn't look like a third, but it appears to be, I'm sorry about that. The grey ones, Allies. What he thought he'd do is try and put the Allies with Brits on either side of them, so that they would be encouraged and heartened by the way the British fought, many of them being Peninsula veterans, and that they would then survive Napoleon's attack. Napoleon saw the value to Wellington of this farm at Hougoumont over here, which is still visible today, sadly derelict, but there's a big appeal going on. I hope many of you might feel you could contribute to try and conserve Hougoumont rather than restore it, conserve it, and try and keep it going as it looked in those days. A farm which Wellington was determined to defend through the day. La Haye-Sainte here in the middle was another farm which Wellington was determined to defend, and also a couple of farms over on this side here. All through the day, Napoleon attacked Hougoumont and attacked La Haye-Sainte. This is a picture here of La Haye-Sainte with, we're looking now from north to south. There's Napoleon's army down there, or most of it. Some of it's come up here to attack Wellington. Here's Wellington on his horse, Copenhagen, is coming into view here. And everything, of course, happening in this picture, great dramatic license, everything's happening. You've got some of the British here in squares resisting the French cavalry attacks. You've got into square if you have a cavalry attack, as I'll show you in a moment, and some of them attacking the infantry in total chaos. But in the morning, at lunchtime, the French attacked on foot, and in the afternoon they attacked with their cavalry. Poor old Thomas Picton was killed with a bullet in the brain very soon after the French attacked his infantry. His infantry succeeded in pushing the French infantry back, and immediately after Picton died, the Scots Greys and other heavy cavalry went in to attack the retreating French infantry who'd been beaten back by Picton's troops. And they made a complete success of their attack on the French infantry, but then they went too far. Uxbridge was their boss, and he went too far. He led his men beyond the French infantry, which they had destroyed, in amongst the French guns. And the French cavalry, who weren't breathless like the British were by this time, attacked the British cavalry. And there were huge numbers of British casualties among the cavalry, including poor old Fred Ponsonby, who was, he was a light dragoon. Fred Ponsonby went in and he came off his horse, and a Polish lancer actually came up and shouted at Fred. He said, "Tu n'es pas mort, coquin? You're not dead, my friend? Well, then let's sort you out." And he shoved his lance right into Fred's lungs, and Fred was left for dead on the battlefield. And it's happened to a number of British cavalrymen. Well, then in came the French cavalry, and you can see here a cuirassier. He's actually a sort of medieval knight wearing a cuirass. Extraordinary. It's a cuirass which wasn't, interestingly enough, impervious to musket fire. Muskets were effective against the cuirass. They just somehow looked rather grand in them, and they looked rather frightening in them, these breastplates. But they attacked the British squares. Now, in a square, in 3 lines of the square with your bayonets pointing out, it's extraordinary how effective they were against cavalry attacks. Hardly a horse in history threw itself against a line of bayonets when the people were in squares. And as long as you kept that square rigidly in formation, and occasionally the square was told to move, allow the Duke of Wellington to come through because he'd been caught outside, but he threw a hole in the square and they'd close up again. As long as the square kept its formation, it would keep the cavalry away, and it did effectively do that. So the British squares succeeded in resisting the French cavalry as the infantry had in the morning, and there's Wellington again, always in the right place at the right time. Unfortunately, having to say now to commanders who said, "Can you give us some help? Sorry, chaps, you're going to have to fight this one out." it's going to be hard pounding, but you're going to fight this one right through the day. And they did. And they all stood, and the line remained steady. And here you can see, there's the line, the same old line up there. The British in squares now facing the cavalry attacks in the afternoon. It's round about tea time. And round about tea time, the French looked over here, and they saw black uniformed Prussians approaching. Napoleon allowed it to be sent around the army that it was Grouchy coming back from his marshal he'd sent off to try and keep the Prussians at bay coming back, but few believed it. And it very soon became apparent that Blucher's, a couple of corps of Blucher's army were moving in here on the right. Lobau was sent off. He should really have been going up this way. He was sent this way. The Young Guard, part of the Imperial Guard, was sent to keep Blucher away. And Wellington, of course, looking over here round about tea time, seeing the Prussians were there, thought, I think we might win this battle. And round about this time, when Blucher was winding up the east wing, the right-hand wing here of the French, and the cavalry were being successfully resisted up here, Napoleon decided, all I can do now, just go back to that picture again, all I can do now, once these cavalry had failed to get through, and the line was still there, and Napoleon even captured La Haye-Sainte. He hadn't captured Hougoumont, but he had captured La Haye-Sainte. He thought, one more effort, and maybe I can break this damn British line. Rather than retreat and fight another battle, I'll put in the Imperial Guard. So he marched up himself at the head of the Imperial Guard, handed over at Ney's suggestion to Ney before he actually attacked, by the way, foolish for Napoleon in the front line. And Ney then led the Imperial Guard against the British Guards who were all now lined up in this position. And Wellington, of course, was quickly there himself, not in the front line, but just behind it, talking to the General Maitland, who was the commander of the Guards, and shouting at Maitland, hang on, wait, Maitland, wait. And wait till you see, as it were, the whites of their eyes. Wait till they get close enough. The important thing about soldiers armed with muskets is not to fire, not to loose them off when it's a waste of time, when they're 100 meters away. Wait till they're close. And then when he saw the Imperial Guard very close up indeed, Wellington said to Maitland, now's your time. And they fired. And there was then toing and froing, a very vicious battle indeed, and all sorts of very heroic things were done on both sides. But the Imperial Guard eventually, of course, pulled back. And the word went round the French army, la garde recule, the guard is pulling back. And Wellington then stood up and allegedly said, I don't know whether it's true or not, he said, oh well, in for a penny, in for a pound, and come on guys, let's go. And the entire British army, Anglo-Allied army, then moved in and wiped out the French. And he and Blucher met at La Belle Alliance, this farm just south of the battlefield. They shook hands, and Wellington was always very generous about Blucher and thanked him very profusely. And also in his dispatches that night, he said how much he owed to the Prussians, and the battle was won. Dear old Fred Ponsonby, I've mentioned that he was left for dead on the battlefield. He was one of 45,000 casualties at the Battle of Waterloo, 45,000 on both sides. And he was very badly wounded indeed. He survived. And this Frenchman came up at one stage when the French had really taken over this area where poor old Fred was wounded. This Frenchman came up and said, here, here's a little sip of cognac for you, and I hope you're all right. But I better go back now because the Brits are going to attack again. So poor old Fred was left there with his glass of cognac. And my dear, he survived. He staggeringly survived. And his sister, Lady Caroline Lamb, came and helped him find his way back to health again in Brussels. 20 years later, when he was governor of Malta, Fred Ponsonby was sitting there, and someone came and said, there's a French delegation come to see you, sir. So he said, oh, how very nice. The French delegation came in, led by a chap who was a sort of middle-aged chap, and said, hello there, where were you at Waterloo? Were you fighting in the great battle? And Fred said, yeah, I was there. I was terribly badly wounded. And this very nice Frenchman came up and gave me a glass of cognac, which really revived my spirits. The Frenchman said, what was he wearing, this chap? And Fred described precisely how he remembered the Frenchman in this blue coat and black hat. And the Frenchman said, it was me. So the great clinch took place. You can imagine, a wonderful small world. Anyway, that's just one of the many stories, which I think is rather lovely. Napoleon was sent off to St. Helena, as we all know, where he spent his time writing his memoirs and saying what a terrible general Wellington still was to his mind. He'd been let down by his own chaps, by Grouchy, by Soult, by Ney, you name it. It was a very sad ending, really, to an extraordinarily impressive life, although he had, of course, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen and a lot of others as well. Wellington went on, of course, to be a politician, and he became prime minister. He achieved a great deal as prime minister, but it wasn't really his métier. And he was a soldier. He wanted to give orders and be obeyed. And coming out of his first cabinet meeting, he's memorably said to have said to a friend of his, when the friend said, "What was it like, your first cabinet?" He said, "Well, it was a very odd affair indeed, because I gave them my orders, and they wanted to sit and discuss them." Anyway, he was prime minister, not a great success. He didn't think there should be the vote given to everybody. He thought that was a bad idea. So the reform bill was not a good idea. That rather put him, made him a little bit passé. But he still went on for, goodness me, another 40 years. And he's held these dinners every Waterloo Day, June 18. He would hold these dinners in Apsley House. And that's that wonderful, the room looks so like that today. Of course, one by one they would fall out until 1852. This is the picture of what it was like then, and there were all these generals and chaps gathered round, including Fred Ponsonby's wife. Fred had died rather sadly, and Fred Ponsonby's wife, Emily, was one of those who was invited, one of the only ladies invited to be at that last dinner. And then, only a few months later, Arthur Wellington died at the end of 1852. And so there we are. I mean, an extraordinary story. And I must say, I think, I mean, someone might ask whether you think Marlborough is the best or Slim or whatever. I think I'd give it to Wellington. But then I would, because I've been spending the last 4 years studying him in such detail. Thank you so much. I'm sorry.